The Impressionist painters held their last exhibition in Paris in 1886, and after that there was much debate about in what direction European art should move. Painters like Paul Cézanne, Paul Gauguin, Vincent van Gogh had one set of answers, and as we moved into the 20th century, Gustav Klimt, Henri Matisse, Pablo Picasso had yet more radical responses. This exhibition, After Impressionism, Inventing Modern Art, at the National Gallery, tells the story of European painting and sculpture in the 3 decades before the First World War. Marianne, is there a break point in art after the last exhibition by the Impressionists?
I would believe fundamentally that there is. And it was a moment where actually even that last exhibition, which was in 1886, which is where we start this exhibition here, was already showing tensions amongst the Impressionists. And so they were each going their own somewhat independent ways.
What sort of ways were they going?
They were questioning once again whether actually just painting a fleeting moment in time was really the primary ambition of art. Yes, it was truth to the moment, but it mightn't necessarily give a greater weight to the meaning of that particular work. And the person who was responsible for getting them thinking in these terms was actually the author, Émile Zola, who wrote a rather scathing critique of Impressionism in 1880, basically saying it's great what they've done so far, but actually they're still stammering. They haven't actually found a voice to turn them into the old masters. So when you get to 1886, that really is the end of that group in terms of group exhibitions, and they are, as I say, already going their own way.
Exhibition begins with a Paul Cézanne. I think a lot of people might think that Cézanne was an Impressionist, but you're implying that this painting takes us beyond.
Absolutely, because in fact, Cézanne only exhibited twice with the Impressionists. He wasn't a devoted exhibitor, like, for example, Pissarro or Degas or whoever. And so he really always held himself a little bit apart. And when you look at the work that he's producing, even in the 1860s and 70s, it doesn't really chime very closely with what the Impressionists were about. You put a Cézanne of the 1870s next to a Monet, and I'm afraid you're looking at two very different approaches, if you like. So by starting with Cézanne here, and this wonderful Great Bathers, painting one of 3 large-scale bathers that Cézanne made at the end of his last decade of his life, you are really posing the question, which direction is he going in next? And is he still committed to some modicum of representing the external world as we would recognize it? Or is he actually saying, no, I'm going to do something really quite fundamentally different? And what he's doing is he's looking at these figures and he's analyzing their forms, the fundamental structures of their forms, and then describing them as a series of very simplified volumes, which he reinforces in terms of simplification by the way in which he handles his paint. Because the paint is actually light and shadow, slabs, rather than subtle graduation, modulation from light to shade. And that kind of almost creates a notion of a faceted figure, faceted surface, which actually lies at the basis of Cubism.
Fascinating. Now, alongside Cézanne in the latter years of the 19th century, Paul Gauguin is going in his direction, and Vincent van Gogh, as we call him without English accents, is going in another direction. Tell me a little bit about those two.
Well, in terms of Gauguin, he's really posed a fundamental question, which was effectively what was sitting in Cézanne's mind, which is if you're no longer going to paint the external world as it is represented, then where does art go? What is your responsibility as an artist? And for Gauguin, he basically pushed naturalism to one side and said, I'm now going to seek non-naturalism as a way basically of drawing attention of the spectator to the fact that he's painting big ideas, fundamental emotions, not just a pretty picture of Breton women, for example, sitting on a grassy meadow. By that I mean basically you break with the notion that when the artist puts his canvas up in front of a motif or creates an image in the studio, he's basically painting a recognizable form. So a figure takes a perfectly logical three-dimensional shape. It sits totally logically within a space which is defined. Now, with Gauguin, he flattens all that out. He basically says, I'm not interested in spatial recession. It's nothing to do with me. I'm actually showing you that I'm pushing in a direction which has nothing to do with your expectation. Vincent van Gogh also absolutely comes into the picture. In this exhibition, one will notice that we only have works from the last 2 years of his life. Up until that point, after he moved from Paris to Arles to set up his studio of the South, he basically was painting still in a style which was derived from a bit of Seurat, Neo-Impressionism, a bit of Monet and Impressionism. But come the early summer, he really starts exploring his own visual voice. And what he does is he simplifies form, he heightens his palette, absolutely becomes much richer, more dynamic. And he basically, very importantly, makes the spectator focus on how the painting is made rather than what it is describing. So you were aware of these extraordinary ladling on of paint or very thin areas of paint where you're actually looking, you're asked to look at how does this work? What is he trying to do with his technique in order to tell us something about the atmosphere or the mood of this particular landscape?
Well, you've made a very convincing case for there being a break point at the end of the 1880s. Shall we move on?
Yes.
Marianne, the artist we've been talking about had a very strong connection with France. But of course, there were artistic developments across Europe. And this painting helps us to understand that, doesn't it?
Absolutely. One of the intentions of the exhibition was not to unseat Paris, because Paris was like a magnet. Artists and collectors just swarmed to Paris because it really was the capital of the arts from the mid-1850s onwards. But at the same time, there were in other European cities, there was a move to establish avant-garde exhibition bodies, which opened their platform, if you like, to artists who were being certainly more experimental, like Klimt, for example. And so what we have is covering Barcelona, Brussels, Berlin, and Vienna, which is where we are now. We're basically saying all four of these cities had these very interesting, very positive, outward-going determinations to have a platform for avant-garde artists. And in the case of Vienna, it all hinges on the establishment of an organization called the Secession, because they seceded from the conventional, traditional art establishment in order to have their own exhibition. And this was in 1898. And Klimt was a leading figure in that creation.
Tell me about this particular painting by Klimt, not one that I've seen before.
No, this is an extraordinary work. It's in a private collection, so it's rarely seen. It is the second of two portraits that Klimt made, Gustav Klimt, of the sitter Adele Bloch-Bauer. This is Bloch-Bauer number 2. Bloch-Bauer number 1 is sitting in New York. And it is really an incredibly important work because it shows him moving forward as a result of having come for the first time to Paris. It is extraordinary that he felt no urge to have to come and see what was going on in Paris, which was pretty energetic, to put it mildly. You've got Matisse, you've got Derain, you've got Picasso, and so on. But actually, that wasn't what he was interested in. But in 1907, he took the decision to go to Paris. And the impact is really immediate, because here we have an artist who, having in a previous portrait of 1904, which is in the National Gallery's collection, it still is an element of three-dimensionality, and it's rather Whistlerian, actually. Here, we have him bold outline, flattened color infill. It becomes a patterned surface. And she is basically a wonderful kind of sequence of serpentine lines, which defines her extremely smart, absolutely up to the moment dress, which she's standing in. But even more than that, It is, I think, a very important work because it shows where his own interests as an artist lay, quite apart from Paris and what he was learning from there, which is, if you look in the background, we have this extraordinary, is it a tapestry, is it a frieze, we're not quite certain, which seems to consist of Chinese figures. So he's basically using that as a way of reinforcing the decorative quality of this. So going back to what we were talking about earlier, this is not naturalistic. This is decorative, this is non-natural.
This is from a private collection. Will there be a number of paintings here with which we're unfamiliar?
Yes, there's a very high percentage, actually, as temporary exhibitions go. We've got about a third of the exhibition comes from private collections. And that is, I regard, very important. Not only does it allow us to identify major works on a par with, masterpieces sitting in museums, which are seen by the public, but bringing these out and making them available to the visitor is really, I think, very important. But secondly, it also does reinforce in the collector's mind the significance of the work that they've acquired. So it takes on its historical significance, if you like.
You mentioned Barcelona, which made me think of Pablo Picasso, who spent a period of his life painting in Barcelona. Shall we move on and look at Picasso, and you can tell us about the end of the story?
Yes, absolutely.
Marianne, you have a fair number of Picassos in the exhibition, and we can see the development within that artist's work. And here is a Picasso from 1909. What stage has he reached here?
What is fascinating about Picasso is how quickly he moves. What he's doing in Barcelona and in Paris at the beginning of the 20th century, 1900, 1901, 1902, really shifts dramatically by the time we get to here. And if you look at those early works, you think, how did he get here? And really what he's doing is he's taking the next step from Cézanne. And whereas Cézanne was obviously analysing form and giving us these faceted descriptions of volume in simplified form, Picasso does one step further. He basically says, if I'm painting the head of Fernande, his mistress, I need to tell you all the information I can see, I can identify about this face. So he works his way around from a number of individual perspectival points in order to give us this incredibly faceted effect.
Much more difficult for the viewer.
Oh, I think much more difficult for the viewer. And in fact, when you look at it, it's only that gradually you realize there's a table with rather wonky legs, with a still life, which, as with Cézanne's still lifes, actually seem to be cascading down the table. So they're not held stably in 3 dimensions. And likewise, with the drapery on the right-hand side, which is maybe a curtain or whatever, the simplification of the folds is geometric. It's nothing to do with how fabric just hangs gently, off a curtain.
It's a glorious exhibition. It's beautifully laid out in these sumptuous rooms. You've a magnificent collection of works here. What would you like the visitor to leave thinking?
I would like the visitor to, first of all, understand that Paris was not the only centre of the art world. There were other centres, equally exploratory, equally experimental, producing works of a very high order. And, by artists that the British public isn't really familiar with. And secondly, I think it is to make it available to the visitor to think about, if art is no longer going to describe the external world in a recognizable form, what are the options open to an artist to explore alternative routes? And that gets us all the way to Cubism.
Well, I found it a great privilege to be with these paintings and to hear your explanations. So I thank you for those and for your time.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope the visitor enjoys the visit enormously.